So one of the things that in conversation with you all, our clients, we talk about quite a bit, especially in certain strategies that we might be using, is the idea of sectors of our economy or sectors of investing. And typically what they're most commonly referred to as are the S&P sectors. The Standard and Poor's defines 11 unique sectors across our economy and investing. I'm going to run you through just real quick what those 11 sectors are, maybe provide an example or two of each, and then we'll close up with a couple of bullet points, 3 or 4 bullet points around this idea and things to think about when you're thinking about sectors of our economy. Number one is information technology, and most of us probably already know what that is, but that is companies that develop or distribute technological items or services. So just about anything that you can think of in those areas. Healthcare, that's your medical supply companies, your pharmaceuticals, scientific-based operations or services. So anything in the medical field, of course, a lot of that is cutting edge as well. Financials, this includes companies in finance, investing, insurance, any of those type of industries or companies. Consumer discretionary, not to be confused with consumer services or consumer staples. Consumer discretionary are your consumer products or service companies that are not necessary for survival. So these might be luxury items that you could purchase at a lower cost somewhere else, but you want a name brand. Might be money spent on recreation, travel, those industries. They're things that we would love to have, but we could probably do without or at least cut back in situations of economic suffering or perceived economic downside. So communication services are companies that you would think of, such as your cellular phone provider, things like that. But also nowadays, it's a lot of the different social media that you and I use. Those are considered communication service companies as well. Industrials. Industrials are companies that are airlines, railroads, military weapon manufacturers, etc. So basically, a lot of those bigger, older companies that produce and manufacture goods. The seventh sector that we mentioned earlier, consumer staples, not related to consumer discretionary. Consumer staples are companies that provide a lot of the necessities of life that we are pretty much have to have, or we feel pretty certain that we need to have them and aren't likely to do without them. Food, beverage companies, household products, companies that might make bleach, tissue paper, all of these different kinds of things. Those are mostly necessary and would fit under the category of consumer staples. Energy consists of all companies from traditional oil and gas, consumable fuel business, alternative fuel energy sources. Anything that you can think of is going to fit under that energy sector. Utilities are those boring companies that typically generate electricity, water, gas to buildings and homes. Those type of companies aren't going to be high flyers, but they're there day in, day out. Us as consumers need them and rely on them. Real estate, or REITs, are called real estate investment trust, and basically that's in that industry is where an investor might be purchasing through a manager a conglomerate of many commercial properties where they are a tiny owner in that share and are invested in commercial real estate. Last but not least is materials. And materials are those companies that provide raw materials needed for other sectors to function. So they are producing the raw earth type materials that we need, but mostly companies need, manufacturing and industrial companies need to manufacture the goods that we're purchasing. Some key takeaways when we're talking about sectors that people really need to focus on is they're not all created equal. And at any given time, depending on what's going on in our economy and our markets, certain sectors may represent much more of the S&P 500 stock market than others. There's always an ebb and flow. Key takeaways: the weighting on these sectors within the S&P evolves over time. What does that mean? If the technology industry is booming, those companies are growing, investors are purchasing those companies, those stock shares, they come to represent a larger percentage of the overall allocation of the S&P 500. So we've had periods of time in our history in the past where technology might have traditionally been 10% of the calculation of all 11 sectors in that S&P 500 stocks. But there's been other times in our history where that might have represented over 1/3 of the total calculation of the value of that index. So there's definitely ebb and flow within that. Throughout the years, booming sectors have created situations where specific sectors have become heavily represented. Again, what we were just talking about, not just technology. In the middle 2000s, financials, banks, because of what was going on around us in that industry and that economy at the time, those became heavily represented. Fast forward a few years to when we had an energy boom. The energy sector began to represent a much larger calculation of the overall return and weight of the market, the S&P 500, than it does, say, today. So that's something to always keep in mind. Owning an index like the S&P or a replicated version, because you cannot directly invest in the S&P 500, but managers get close, owning that is absolutely no guarantee of a diversified portfolio. So many investors may mistakenly think that I own the S&P 500, I own 500 of the largest companies in America, I'm well diversified. In a perfect world where all sectors would be weighted close to the same, that would certainly probably be an accurate statement. But we don't live in a perfect world, and certain times in certain economic cycles, like we talked about before, certain industries represent way more of the calculation. So just being invested in a low-cost S&P 500 type like fund does not mean that at any given time you're diversified properly. During many cycles of our economy, expansion, contraction, plateau, certain sectors will typically outperform or underperform for obvious reasons that we just talked about. So those are the 11 sectors of our economy. We talk about that a lot, so I thought I would make a clearer presentation of what exactly those 11 sectors are, but then provide some takeaways of things that we have to consider, that we are considering when we talk about investing in sectors.